times, and we'll be doing our VBS lesson in the morning, and then we'll do another VBS lesson in the evening, and then a regular worship in the morning and abbreviated worship tomorrow night. So I appreciate everybody coming. Feel free to bring somebody else tomorrow if you have an opportunity to. If there's somebody you know should be here that's not. So with that, we'll start with the word of prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Aaron. Let's pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, how grateful and thankful we are for each and every day of life that you give us. We're so thankful for the families that are here this morning. We're grateful for each and every individual. We pray, Father, that you help us to encourage and uplift each other. Help us to focus on our lessons. Help us to listen to the things that are being taught so that we might be better servants of yours. We're so thankful and grateful for each and every one that's participated in this event, for our teachers, for those that have helped do decorations, for those that are helping with the food. And we pray, Father, that you bless them for their efforts. Father, we're so grateful for all the many different abilities that you've given those within this congregation, some to teach and some to serve in other capacities, some to encourage each other, some to work acts of benevolence. We're so thankful, Father, that we don't all play the exact same role, but that each one works together to make this a cohesive effort on your behalf. Father, we pray that all things we do are always done in a pleasing manner, in a way that you would be pleased with. And we pray, Father, that you continue to abide with us a little while longer. All these things we pray in the name of your Son, our Savior, King Jesus. Amen. All right, Abraham.
All right. First one's number 851, and most of them is going to be in the songbook, and on the projector. So I guess it kind of defeats the purpose. Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven are what I can see. When my Lord is living in me, I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Green grass and flowers all blooming in springtime are works of the Master. I live for each day. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Tall mountains, green valleys, the beauty that surrounds me all make me aware of the one who made it all. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Our next one is number 810. Number 810. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me sing Be Happy. If the skies above you are gray, you are feeling so blue. If your cares and burdens seem great all the whole day through, there's a silver lining that shines in the heavenly land. Look by faith and see it, my friend. Trust in His promises, friend. You gotta sing and be happy today. Press along to the goal. Trust in Him who leadeth the way. He is healing your soul. Let the world know where you belong. Look to Jesus and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song. Sing, be happy today. Often we are troubled and tired, sick with sorrow and pain. There are others living in sin, blessed with earthly gain. Take new courage, we cannot tell what tomorrow may bring. When the dark clouds vanish away, then your heart truly can sing. Sing and you'll be happy today. Press along to the goal. Trust in Him who leadeth the way. He is healing your soul. Let the world know where you belong. Look to heaven and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song. Sing, be happy today. Oft we fail to see the rainbow up in heaven's fair sky. When it seems the fortunes of earth frown and pass us by, there are things we know that are worth more than silver and gold. If we hope and trust Him each day, we shall have pleasure untold. You gotta sing and you'll be happy today. Press along to the goal. Trust in Him who leadeth the way. He is healing your soul. Let the world know where you belong. Look to heaven and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song. Sing, be happy today. Our next song is actually not in the book, so I can put this down. And I'm going to need everyone to stand up, especially the kids. Okay. All right. So, I don't know if you guys knew this, but I'm actually in the Army, if you didn't know. And the adults know where I'm going with this, okay? But I'm in the Lord's Army. Now, I'm going to need your help to sing this out, okay? So sing out, sing loud, sing proud, all right? Now, I believe I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I feel like Brett was having a little too much fun there. I don't know. I'm just messing with you. Okay, so the next song, which is in the book, you can sit down if you want to. If you want to. Is number 870, which no one's using the songbook, so whatever. I'm happy today. Oh yes, I'm happy today. In Jesus Christ, I'm happy today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm happy today. I'm singing today. Oh yes, I'm singing today. In Jesus Christ, I'm singing today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm singing today. I'm praying today. Oh yes, I'm praying today. In Jesus Christ, I'm praying today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm praying today. I'm happy today. Oh yes, I'm singing today. In Jesus Christ, I'm praying today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm sharing today. All right, now I might need everyone to stand back up again. So sorry. Okay, so I believe that's how it starts. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the wise man's house stood firm. Oh, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came tumbling down. Oh, the rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the foolish man's house went flat. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ, and the blessings will come down. Oh, the blessings come down as the prayers go up. The blessings come down as the prayers go up. The blessings come down as the prayers go up. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay. All right, so our next song, and we're going to sing this twice through, is going to be number 872. Number 872. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, and the life that I now live in flesh I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, and the life that I now live in flesh I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. You may be seated. All right. So, for our last one, you know what? You guys want to go ahead and get in the gospel chariot? You got, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear anything. Oh, okay. All right. So we can do that. Roll the gospel chariot along. Roll
towards the end of class so that we know that there's only 5 minutes left, so we can start wrapping up. And then after that, like I said, we'll have another bell. That will be the end of the first class. Then we'll have a break for snacks for the children, and if there's some leftover snacks for the adults too. Okay. Then we'll have our second class. So everybody is dismissed to their classes. Thank you.
Oh, not really quite. That was my first trip. Moved everything without everything falling. That's right. There's always time. Well, good morning. Thanks for everybody for being here on a Saturday morning. What I try to do with this lesson, we've all heard about Noah's Ark and the global flood. I'm going to have to move this or I'm going to trip. Then it'll be on YouTube in perpetuity. We've all heard the story of the flood multiple times as a youth or as an adult. Even those new to the church have heard this multiple times. What I try to do with this lesson is give maybe some thoughts that you can share with those that maybe don't believe. And not that it's not going to be, not that the intent wasn't to be edifying to everyone. But this is one of the things from a Christian evidences standpoint that a lot of people say that there's just no way. So you're telling me hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, whatever they believe about the time frame of the earth, that there was this guy where they didn't have any tool. They hadn't even created the wheel yet, and this guy built this ark out of wood, and there was millions of species of animals that were on this ark. There's no way that those could have all been on there. So hopefully, give a little bit of background. I'm going to cover what is really interesting, and then Dan's going to get the rest of it and mop up on Sunday. So no, Dan and I haven't coordinated everything, but I've kind of told him what I'm going to cover, and if he runs out of material, he's just going to review my lesson. So that's good tactics of a teacher, right? If you're not prepared, I've done that several times presenting for work. If you're not prepared, just go back over some stuff to fill some time. No, I'm joking. Dan will do fine. But so I'm going to cover leading up to the flood, what the world was like in this class. I've got to 15 after? Something like that. What time have I got to? Who said? I wasn't paying attention. I was running the song. 10:15. Okay. All right. So we may get into a little bit of the ark in here, but I wanted to go through what the world was like and the ark in specifics
And we'll see how far we get into that. So in Genesis 6, 5 through 6, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the wickedness of man was great. I think there's some important concepts in here in this text, if we look at it closely, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil or continually evil. Sometimes I like to look at different translations, especially Young's literal translation. There's some issues with that, as are there with every man-made translation. You know, I guess if you really want to get down to it, unless you are a Greek or a Hebrew scholar and you're reading the original manuscripts, there's always going to be some things to be aware of. But Young's literal translation, I think, is interesting to read in verse 5. It says, "And Jehovah seeth the abundant," and this Young's literal translation is literally taking the word-by-word translation. It doesn't worry about grammar at all. Maybe that's why I like it. I don't worry about grammar that much, especially when I write. But it said, "And Jehovah seeth that abundant the wickedness of man in the earth." And this is the part that I think is interesting in Young's literal translation. "And every imagination of the thoughts of his heart only evil all the day." So, obviously that's grammatically incorrect or hard to follow, but every imagination of his thoughts were evil all the day. So that paints a picture of mankind at that time that was extremely bleak. We'll see in a little bit where there was a lot of violence on the face of the earth. So every thought that is how it's depicted in Scripture. Every thought that mankind had, his continual thought was evil. Now, we have some difficult times in this day and age, but I think we can all agree that not all of mankind has evil thoughts. You see a lot of good in the world today. If you'll look, we don't always see that from a media standpoint, or God forbid you get on Twitter and make a comment about something, or Facebook or whatever. It's hilarious and sad oftentimes to see, people would not have those conversations face to face. I think that's some of what's wrong with the world today. People get upset with and have conversations with, one, people you don't even know. Two, people are saying things that you wouldn't say face to face because it's just a faceless comment. But as a whole, I think mankind is still, has a lot of good in their hearts, some better than others. You see people that, and you hear stories. There was a Facebook story or account that one of my Facebook friends from way back in junior high school, so that was a long time ago, put out there that he was heading to the lake and with their camper, and their truck air conditioner went out, and he said, "Well, we'll just go with our windows rolled down. That's not that far of a trip for us." And about 15 minutes from the campground they were going to, the serpentine belt on his truck went out. So if you know anything about modern vehicles, we used to have several belts on a vehicle, and they would run one pulley and off another, and one belt broke, it wasn't that big of a deal. Well, with a serpentine belt, it goes all the way around. It runs almost all your devices on your engine: water pump, air pump, oil pump, air conditioner, what's the thing that does the electricity, Larry? Alternator. There you go. I knew I was going to get it. And so if one of those breaks, your engine's basically dead. Well, he just happened there was a mechanic that happened to come by and stop to see if he needed some help. And he was telling him his story, and he had literally just lost his job at his auto repair place, and he had packed up all of his tools, and he had all of his tools in his vehicle. And he said, "I'll help you out." And so he shuttled him to the auto parts store, which is about a 10 or 15 minute trip, and got him a serpentine belt and put that on and said, "Well, let's check to see if any of these pulleys are seized up." And maybe that's the reason the serpentine belt broke, because kind of odd for those to break, especially on this brand or age of vehicle, and sure enough, the air conditioner pulley was seized up, and that's why the air conditioner wasn't working. So he took him back to the auto parts store, brought him back with the AC condenser, put that on, and of course, he paid for all the parts. And he asked me, he's like, "Oh man, I really appreciate this. How much do I owe you?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know, $40 sound reasonable." So he had just lost his job. He was on his way home to take his kids swimming in their pool, and had the kindness in his heart to stop, even though he was having a bad day, I'm sure. And he only wanted to charge the guy $40. My friend on Facebook paid him more than that, just because he was, very thankful. It would cost him much more than that to get that fixed. So that's just one story. I'm sure everybody can think of other stories, and we've heard of other stories. So our world is, as corrupt as it may seem sometimes, I don't think I know it's not nearly as bad as it was back in the time of Noah. So God was sorrowful that he had made mankind. He grieved in his heart that he had made man. So God has made this whole creation. He's made mankind. He has created all this greatness. He was sorrowful. He's already been disappointed by Adam and Eve. He built a beautiful garden to give to them to live however long they could live in there. And it was a perfect, from all descriptions that we see, it was a perfect temperate, perfect climate for humans, mankind to live in. I'm sure it was very beautiful, but they couldn't withstand temptation, and the world entered into sin. Now, this is not too long after God created the earth. We'll look a little bit later, about 1,000 years or so, a little longer maybe. And the world is basically just turned to evil, corruption, and violence. And so we think we have it bad these days. We think of some things that, go on in the world of, humans abusing humans and people not caring for each other and all that stuff. But it wasn't as bad as back then. Their thoughts were evil continually. Keep that in mind. They were evil continually. And, I've looked up the word, a little bit of word study. I'm certainly no Hebrew scholar here, but every account that I can find means that, they were always thinking about evil. Their desire was always to do evil. It wasn't, I think I'm going to go out and do this that's evil. It was continually evil, not just every once in a while, from everything that I can find anyway. So let's look at God's sorrow here in verse 7. So the Lord said, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." Look at that last phrase here. For I am sorry that I made them. Has anything that you've ever created made you so sorrowful that you wanted to destroy it? Now, I know sometimes our kids aggravate us. And, going back to the Cosby Show, his phrase is, "I brought you into this world, I'll take you out." I know that sometimes for a fleeting moment that, we get aggravated, or we have to take a deep breath, or we have to walk away, or whatever. But I dare say that none of us have been so sorrowful that we brought a child into the world that we wanted to destroy them. I hope not. If you do, you've got probably some issues. But maybe the kid does too, but anyway. We're supposed to be able to manage those, right? And so God was so sorry, so disappointed in mankind that of what he had created, that he wanted to destroy the whole earth. I don't know what's wrong with this thing, but Dan, what'd you do to this? Is it me? Okay. He said he was going to destroy everything from the face of the earth, man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air. The flood didn't affect necessarily the birds of the air, except for birds can't fly. They don't have in-flight refueling, so they can't just fly around for a year, like probably Dan will get into. I'm not going to get into that, how long they were on the ark, but they were on the ark about a year. No way in the world birds can stay in the air for that long, so they were on the ark. The animals that were made happy and the mammals were the ones that were aquatic, right? And they had a huge aquarium, so they didn't have to worry about all that. But God was going to destroy everything on the earth, including mankind. He certainly didn't have it out for the animals necessarily. They were just kind of a byproduct. We don't read anywhere where the animals were disappointing, right? It was the humans. It was mankind that he had created, that he was sorrowful that he had created. So we obviously can't think like God. We can't have the mind of God, right? But what I like to do, at least in my studies, is kind of put myself in their shoes, either in the first century Christians, and try to imagine. Sometimes I probably get it wrong, but imagine and put myself in their predicament. And so, and I'm not here trying to say any shape, form, or fashion that we can think like God. But let's look at some of the things that God tells us about how he thinks and what makes him sorrowful. So this grieved God greatly. He wants every soul to go to heaven. He's not, I talked about this a little bit Wednesday night in my devotional, that God's no respecter of persons. He wants every soul that's ever been born, from Adam until the last person that's born on the face of the earth, to go to heaven. He wanted all of these people that were alive, that were so wicked, that their thoughts were continually evil. He wanted them to go to heaven, just like he does everybody here in this classroom, and everybody in this building, and everybody in this town and state, and keep expanding it. So this would have grieved God. God grieves whenever people disobey him. We know that. We read that in Scripture. He is, some people try to say that God is a vengeful God. That's not right. That's not the right phrase. That's not the right terminology. God is a just God. God is also a fair God. Do we ever read of any instance in the Old Testament where God acts directly upon people that he's acted unfairly? No. And you guys can talk, by the way. If you have questions, raise your hand. This is not supposed to be a sermon. This is a class setting. So I've got my thoughts, but if you guys have any comments or questions, feel free to interrupt. They will be welcome, trust me. So he's a fair God. He's a just God. He's a demanding God. And that's where some people kind of get a misperception that he's a vengeful God. He's not. What happened with Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant? Somebody relate that story for me real quick in a bullet point fashion. What were they told? How were they told to handle the ark? Carry it with poles as it was designed, right? As God had told them to do that, right? It had rings in it, and they put poles through the rings, and they carried it on their shoulders. They weren't supposed to touch the ark. What were they told was going to happen if they touched the ark? You shall surely die. It didn't say you were going to die eventually. It said you shall surely die, depicting an imminent event. And so what happened to the people? They got lazy, right? Hey, I got a better idea. Man, this thing is heavy. Hey, why don't we put it on this ox cart? That'd be great. We can just transport it from one place to another. These ox will carry it, and we don't have to worry about carrying that on our shoulders, right? Well, what happened? It stumbled. Did Uzzah have good intentions, more than likely? Yeah. It's aggravating. I think we need a new one of these cords. That's what the deal is. Where's our AV deacon? He's not here. So Uzzah, by all accounts, had good intentions. That's a natural human reaction, right? Something's getting ready to fall, especially if it's something of that value. That was extremely important to them in this day and age. And so Uzzah is, maybe Uzzah, I don't know, maybe, and this is just my speculation, maybe Uzzah was one of the ones that said, hey guys, this isn't a good idea. We're not supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to be carrying this on our shoulder. And they probably know, shut up, Uzzah. That's what I imagine. That's my story I have dreamt up in my head anyway. Maybe not accurate, but so Uzzah tries to catch this ark. Good intentions. Good intentions. What happened to Uzzah? Was God vengeful? No. God did what he said he was going to do. So God always does what he says. God always says what he means. When God says he's grieved with people that disobey him, he is grieved in his heart. These were, it depends on what you look at as far as number speculation, and it's just that. Anywhere from tens of millions of people on the face of the earth, and sometimes maybe lower, to anywhere up to 1 billion people or so that were alive in the day of the flood. And I don't know how you can accurately predict that just from the genealogies. But anyway, somebody had to come up with a number right. We couldn't just say there were lots of people. You got to have a number associated with it, right? But there were several people on. Doesn't matter. Even if there's 2 people or 8 people or 10 people alive on the face of the earth, God wanted all those to go to heaven. So all of these people that were wicked, that were continually doing evil, God was grieved in his heart because they were disobedient. They were not obedient to him. So God is so sorrowful that he's going to destroy what he created. And again, we certainly can't look at this on the scope of what God has done in creating the earth. I'm not trying to say that at all, but if you've ever worked on a large project and then either it got destroyed or you were so aggravated that maybe you took a hammer and hit it, and it was your last piece to fit in this thing, or your last piece of the model to put together or whatever, and you got so aggravated you just crushed the whole thing. It's like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. But no, you're so aggravated, you were so sorrowful for that you tried to destroy it. I tried to come up with another analogy for God and creating the world and us being aggravated. This is as close as I could come. But again, we can't get in the mind of God. But think about something maybe in your life that you had put a lot of time into, and then you were so aggravated that you destroyed it. We really have no comparison, like I said, to what God has created. But again, he was so distraught, he was so sorrowful that he created mankind that he was going to destroy it. But we do have hope, thankfully. There were some righteous people alive on the face of the earth. In verse 8, it says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Noah found favor with God. Verse 8 is the first time that we have the word grace used in the Bible, at least that I can find. And I think that's important. Noah found grace. Noah was righteous. He found favor with God. He was trying to do right in a world that was continually just evil, just wicked. And so sometimes we find ourselves maybe in that position. We're in a job where there are some after-hours activities to where people socialize, and maybe the boss is there, the boss's boss is there, whatever, and your peers are all there except for you, and there's lots of drinking and maybe debauchery going on that Christians just don't. Not that you can't go out and go to Applebee's to a happy hour and sit and drink a diet soda, but sometimes that's a little uncomfortable for Christians to do, right? If you know that you're going to a happy hour, hey, you going to happy hour? Yeah, I'll be there. Yeah, I'll be there drinking a Diet Coke. What does "yeah, I'll be there" kind of signify? Yeah, sure, that's fine. I'll go out with you guys. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm saying it's maybe something to give you pause. But maybe there's some things that go on in your workplace or where you go to school or your neighborhood or even your own family or whatever that you can't be a part of. And because you're a Christian, you're trying to live life like God has told you, and we've read about how to live our lives. I don't think we have as bad as Noah has it. Noah's living in a world that's just absolutely corrupt. He's living in a world where, by all accounts, they're the only family that's trying to live the right way. There may have been others. We don't have a record of that. Whose family was the only one that was on the ark? No. Do we have any other indications? I'm going to switch this to my other ear because Jerry doesn't have this problem. Maybe it's a right ear versus left ear deal. I don't know. I think it's this cord. It got worn out, and these are thin wires in here. So anyway, maybe that'll stop. But do we have any other record of other families being excluded from the ark? Is there any text in that Genesis flood account that says Noah and his family were the only ones that were going to be allowed on the ark? Not that I can find. So that kind of indicates, you can kind of put two and two together, and like I tell our teen class all the time, you kind of take things to a logical conclusion. I think our logical, safe conclusion there is Noah and his family was probably the only ones that were trying to live for God in the whole world. Imagine that. Now, I know that sometimes in high school and stuff, that's a tough time, right, Abraham? And Brett, I mean, were you the only guys that were Christians in your class or in even your high school maybe? Yeah, so that's kind of a rough situation, right? Well, were your whole high school at Fort Zumwalt West, were their thoughts continually evil? Yeah? Okay, the entire class of whatever graduating class you were, what, 2016, 2017?
Yeah, around my junior year, it was like 2,100.
Okay.
And only 7 people were Christians.
Okay, so then there were some people that were trying to act decently, right? Not everybody. So you weren't the lone soldier there, even though it might have seemed like it. But in Noah's instance, it seems like from the entire world, at least you could come to services or church camp or devos or whatever and be surrounded with other Christians, right? Noah didn't have a Gateway area Bible camp to go to be surrounded by other Christians for a week, from everything that we see here. So imagine what Noah and his family were going through at this time. They were trying to live right. They found favor in the eyes of God. God gave his grace to Noah, but we don't have a record of anybody else in the whole world. I think we can come to that conclusion that probably Noah and his family were the only ones that were trying to be living for what God has set forth for him. So we know that Noah was a righteous man. We look in verse 9, Genesis 6. This was the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, and Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We know that Noah was a just man by looking at this section of Scripture. We know that Noah walked with God. And again, a stark contrast to the rest of the world and what was going on around him. So let's look at the violence and the corruption on the earth. I think this is important to kind of dig into because it gives us a depiction of what was going on on the earth with mankind at that time. Verse 11 says, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So again, go back a few verses. It talks about their thoughts were continually evil. Now, in verse 11, it talks about the earth was filled with violence. So there's a little bit of difference between people having evil thoughts and then also the earth being filled with violence. So there was just wickedness. There was violence everywhere. You know, think about being in some of our Middle Eastern countries and some of these weird places that there's just, warlords. It's literally like the Wild Wild West. Afghanistan before 9/11 used to be the most dangerous place to be on the face of the earth. There was an article in National Geographic or Outside Magazine or whatever that rated the top 10 most dangerous places to be on the earth. And at the time before 9/11, bin Laden and his group were ratcheting up, and it was literally like the Wild Wild West. You would take your life into your own hands if you went to these places because it was just so filled with violence. And we have some areas in the world like that today. That if you're not a native of that country, even if you are, especially if you stand out, if you are a light-skinned person and you're in this area, they know you're not from around there. And so just about guaranteed violence will be brought upon your head, or at least be chasing you. So the thoughts of the people were continually evil. The earth was filled with violence. And indeed, it was corrupt. For what it says in the last verse here, for all flesh had corrupted their way on earth. So they were corrupt, there was violence, their thoughts were continually evil. So that's what mankind was on the earth today. Is it discouraging sometimes in our workplaces, in our communities, in our schools, or whatever, of the way people act? Yes, no, right? It's not in my office. We have in my office where I sit every day, we have a strict no cursing policy, and we're not playing any bad music. I work for my home office, so we've all voted, and we don't do any of that stuff. But I do have to make my own coffee. But anyway, that's the down part. Yes, go ahead.
I work in human resources.
Yeah.
I work for a hospital organization as system health. And, every day the word of God, it's freely, and it's active health organization. So there are people who at least have good hearts walking around there, people that refer to as sister or father.
Sure.
But there are also statements where they will take a public party line and talk about protecting a certain class of people, and so my Christian values every day are, challenged on how I respond or how I react to
Sure.
what they do. And I found, like, hearing Fred Rhodes speak, saying, you beat somebody with a head with a Bible, they're just listen.
Sure.
But, no matter how bad that is, like you said, just try to envision how bad or evil it would be, like walking at night at 2 a.m., in a district where there's lots of drinking and bad stuff happening all the time.
Sure.
Even during the day, I can't even imagine it.
Right.
But I don't think there's any way that we can imagine. I hope that we can, sometimes we feel like it.
Sure. Yeah, and good point, Sharon. And that's kind of the whole point. I don't know if you heard everything she said, but basically she works in HR at SSM, and even with the religious people there, with the sisters and the fathers and all that stuff, there's still things that go on, and statements that are made, and things that are done that certainly aren't what God wants us to have. And she made a good analogy about being I don't know of anybody here that probably wants to go to let's see, North Kings Highway and 70 about 3 a.m. and say, hey, anybody want to talk about God? Man, you got to have a lot of courage. You better be right with God on that one before you go and do that, because you just might meet your maker that night. I mean, St. Louis, any major city, and you're right. That's a good analogy, Sherry, I think. It would be like living continually, even in the daylight hours, in an environment like that. And that's, what some of these places in the world are like. In Afghanistan or whatever, you're in fear for your life all the time. And that's the way, what a horrible way and a stressful way to live. And at least in my mind, I think that's kind of what Noah and his family were dealing with at this time. So we see evil thoughts continually, and we're seeing that violence was filled, earth was filled with violence, and that all flesh was corrupt. So a very, very poor environment for a Christian to be living in. So again, the wickedness is great. I do this all the time in my presentations. I start talking and I don't advance my PowerPoints, but that's okay. So we've covered all this. The earth was just wicked. It was horrible. It was horrible. I think that's important to understand as to why God decided to destroy the earth. Because sometimes you get some comments from people outside the church that aren't Christians, or especially atheists. It's like, well, wait a minute. You mean this fairy tale of God creating the earth that you guys subscribe to, So wait, you're telling me that God, you have a God that went to all this trouble to create this magnificent thing that we call the earth, and he created humans, and then he destroyed all of them except for 8 people? That's a good fairy tale. Sure beats, Mother Goose or the old lady in the shoe. The old lady in the shoe, that was really good. Had a lot of people living in a big boot, right? Well, that was more believable than Noah and the ark and putting all the animals. You got to be kidding me. But if you really go back and you really study it, obviously to study with somebody, they've got to believe that there is a God. You can still convert atheists if you work at it enough. Some of them you can't. It's interesting to talk to them. But anyway, you can go back and look at these verses that say that, the earth was just filled with violence. It was horrible. It was evil. And it would have had to, that's the whole point to these 7 or 8 slides I have here, and trying to take a lot of time in looking at this, is how bad mankind had gotten. We have a similar story of this later on, right? People didn't learn what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah. Man, that was a bad place. It was so bad in Sodom and Gomorrah that when an angel got sent into Sodom and Gomorrah, they tried to rape him. How wicked is that? And what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? They tried to find X number of righteous people. They couldn't do that. And it got down, and so God destroyed the whole area. God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's another lesson about, well, God's not fair. What about Lot's wife? She was just curious. Like, well, maybe that's where curiosity killed the cat came from. I don't know. But what was Lot and his wife and his family told not to do? They were told to flee, and they were told not to do one thing. And what was that? What was going to happen if they looked back? It turned into a pillar of salt. What happened? Lot's wife wanted to see what was going on. Maybe Lot was really curious, and his daughters, and whatever. That's a whole other story about debauchery in the world. We think we've got weird things going on today. Old Testament, if you really look at some of those things, there's a lot of odd stuff going on back then too. But God did what he said. God gave them a way of escape, right? Lot survived. Lot didn't look back. Didn't mean that Lot was stronger. I've heard some of those comments too. Lot wasn't necessarily any stronger than his wife. Whatever. If you hear something blowing up behind you, natural and human curiosity is going to be to look back, right? If something blows up out here outside in a big ball of fire out here on Mexico Road, you're probably going to want to look, even though we might not need to. At least in this analogy with Lot and his wife. So there's a lot of corrupt things going on in the world today. I'm going to have to speed up. I'm going to be here till Sunday. We got a lot of bad stuff going on in our world. We've got lack of respect for human life. We've got abortions going on every day that are ending the lives of human beings. There's no other way to get around that. Even if you want to do abortions and people want to talk about abortions that are, early term, just a few weeks old. That's still a human life. We've got people that are fighting tooth and nail and get aggravated that they can't have late-term abortions at 24 weeks. You ever seen a picture of a 24-week-old child? They're wanting to kill those babies for convenience sake. It's not because the mother is in trouble from a medical standpoint. It's not. It's a convenience sake. So we have that going on in our world today. We have corrupt governments. And I'm not talking about just ours. Yes, our government is corrupt. It's been, how long our government's been corrupt? Since about when George Washington was elected. So it's nothing new. Governments have been corrupt all over the world. Absolute power leads to absolute corruption. It always does. Mankind can't help themselves. I'll get to you in just a second. Mankind can't help themselves. So I'm not just talking about our government. It's governments around the world that are corrupt. They want power. The more power they get, they'll do whatever they need to keep it. Yes, Abraham.
Just to kind of piggyback off of what you said involving abortion, I feel like most or all of us here have heard the argument, well, what if something bad happens to the wife or something like that? And that's the argument that try and use that as their sort of exception.
Right.
Even still, but we already know that that's not the biggest one.
Right. And you're right. And it's, the stance they take is, well, what about rape? And what about the mother's health? Well, death in childbirth used to be a big thing back in Little House on the Prairie days. Are we living in Little House on the Prairie days? How many people in the United States live more than 6 hours by car from a hospital? You're not having to hitch up the buggy and the wagon to take Ma to town to see Doc for a medical condition. It's not. Even out in rural, we went out to Yellowstone in 2015. Man, if you want to see some wide open spaces, drive down through the southern part of Wyoming for it seems like 3 days. There's nothing. I mean, nothing. I had Billy look up how many people live in Wyoming. And he said, they get it. They went to Wyoming. They went through Yellowstone and down through that area. There's only about 560,000 people in the whole state. There's more people that live in St. Louis City than that live in all of Wyoming. I mean, you drive for an hour and not see a building. I'm like, it's like being on the moon. And so you're not that, even out there, there may be a couple hours from a hospital. So back in the 1800s, 1700s, back in the 1700s, whenever, the big treatment for some ailment was to go to the barber and get bled, they had a lot of issues with women dying in childbirth, but not anymore. And you're right, that's not a kid. 99.9% of the abortions are done for convenience of the mother. Anyway, we'll be here for another day and a half talking about that. People are looking to get something for nothing, talking about violence and corruption on the earth. I use this a lot in our teen class, and kids in teen class may think I'm, stuck on Hitler, but I think we look at Hitler. You just look at Hitler and how evil he was. His thoughts were continually evil. He was responsible for not just the Jewish population, but if you really go read history and what he was responsible for, tens of millions of people he was directly responsible for exterminating from the face of the earth just because of his own wicked ideas. And so you take Hitler and you multiply him by how many ever people were on the world minus the 8 people that were in Noah's family. That's the way I think of the world was at the time. I don't think Hitler had very many good thoughts. I really don't. I think Hitler was just an evil person. That's all he thought about. He thought he was doing good. He wanted to have what? A one race, a master race, right? Which was kind of funny because the master race he was looking at didn't look like him. So why didn't he exterminate himself? I mean, it saved everybody a lot of trouble. But he didn't even have the courage enough to face his captors, which kind of showed you him and bin Laden kind of the same thing. Bin Laden, whenever the SEALs raided his house, he was hiding behind some women. Hitler was hiding in a bunker and committed suicide. What a coward. If you thought you were so right, come and face your accusers. If you think you're so right and you want to stand for all that, then preach it to the world in the trials that are going to come. He didn't even have the courage to do that. But so when I think of evil continually, violence and corruption in the earth, I think about people like Hitler, Charles Manson, people like that seem to just have only evil thoughts, nothing good. Whether it's for show, which I think Manson was psychotic, but some of that was for show. He was putting on some dramatics there, but he was certainly evil. Hitler was certainly evil. People like that is what I think of that the world was like during this day and age. Whenever Noah was around. So the time of the flood, we'll do this, and then we'll break. So kind of the estimates on when the flood was as far as the time frame goes. Noah was born around 1,056 years or so, probably, if the genealogies and times are all correct, after creation. They're about right around 2944 BC. These are estimates within a few years, maybe even a decade or so. On these, they vary from source to source. And the flood begins about 1,600 years after creation. This is, if you look in secular history, this was approximately in the Bronze Age of secular history. So what we're going to talk about in the next class session is how how they were even able to build the ark, because you get that from a lot of people that aren't Christians or don't believe the creation story, creation account of the world. It's called a story or a fable. But my point on this next class session is to really look at some things from maybe an objective standpoint of, hey, this really might have been able to happen, and maybe give you some things that you can discuss with some people. It's like, hey, did you know that they built the ark during the Bronze Age? Really? I didn't know that. So maybe give you some thoughts and some things that you can bring about to some folks when you're talking to them about God and a way to maybe open a door. Maybe start with the ark. The ark's kind of a talking about beating people over the head with the Bible. The ark is kind of a I don't want to say safe, but kind of a benign thing. Maybe to start talking with some people about everybody. Just about everybody's heard the account of the ark. A lot of people don't believe it, but you start talking about things that could actually be factual, where it could have actually, in their mind, could have actually happened, and solidify that. Maybe that will help. All right. Hey, I finished 2 minutes early. What a deal. I didn't think I was going to. So we'll take a break until what, 10:30?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for coming.
There is something wrong. Oh, yeah. That's crazy. Huh? That's crazy. I'm gonna check it out. That's crazy though. That's wow.
They closed the auditorium doors, so I guess it's time to get started. So, as I mentioned, we're going to go through maybe some things that will help us from a secular historical standpoint. Now, obviously, we don't have to worry about secular history or the Bible, agreeing with secular history. Secular history's got to agree with the Bible. But whenever we can make some things tie together from a secular history standpoint and look at something in history, it's like, well, wait a minute, right here in the Bible it shows us. Sometimes that might help us be able to talk to some folks. So if you want to turn to Genesis 4 and verse 21, back up just a little bit in Genesis, talking about skilled craftsmen and how could they build the ark? How could they even know how to build the ark? Well, let's look at Genesis 4, 21 through 22 here. It said his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. In verse 22, and as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So, I don't know if you've ever tried to, maybe this is your VBS arts and crafts project. Go home and try to build a flute out of a stick and a rock and see how far you get. It can't be done. I couldn't build one. I don't have the skills. I couldn't build one if you gave me Norm Abrams' $150,000 woodwork shop. It's okay, guys. I won't bite. You can go on and get your cookies. It's fine. And so what kind of tools and skills is it going to take to build things like harps, flutes, other instruments of music in that day? Tubal-Cain was a master craftsman teaching others. So they had people teaching tradecraft. They had the tools, they had the ability, they had the knowledge to be able to make fine instruments. This was before Noah even started cutting down the gopher wood for the trees. So they would have had skilled craftsmen. We know that. We know Tubal-Cain, and that was just one example that we have in the Bible, that he was an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. What can you make with bronze, and what can you make with iron? Can you make some broad axes with iron? Can you make some saws? Can you make some hammers? Maybe make some nails? Things like that. And so I think people often look at the time of Noah as like they were just cavemen back then. They hadn't even invented the wheel. They were still going around going, ooh, oh, 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 and there was no language, right? That's what the general world thinks, that are uneducated about God. They think that the time of the flood was the caveman eras, and people were still using clubs to hunt animals with and bang them over the head. And they had barely discovered fire in those days. That's just not the case. They had fine craftsmen that could make these fine instruments of music. If you've ever watched a craftsman build a violin, it takes a lot of precision. How you scoop out the wood, how you string the instrument, what you string it with. There's a ton of knowledge that goes into something like that. To make a harp, to make a flute. Go out and you can buy kits that you can make, if you're really into woodworking, you can make a flute. And with some, they give you a package of wood, and you've got to have some tools and stuff. If you think it's easy to build an instrument of music that sounds like an instrument and it can actually play notes, go buy one of those kits. And even if you're a skilled craftsman, it's a challenge oftentimes. And so think about what it would take to build something like that and skills that they would have to have. Go back a little further, Genesis 3 and 23 mentions that Cain tilled the ground. I suppose you could look really hard and find a rock that you could attach to a couple of sticks and have maybe your brother Abel pull it. But more than likely, they had the knowledge of how to build these things. Now, did God give God give Adam and Eve the knowledge, or did they gain the knowledge whenever they ate of the tree of good and evil, of that fruit? Did they gain the knowledge? And I don't know, but I think it's pretty evident that they would have had some type of knowledge that God had given mankind from the beginning that got passed on, and it got better, got more advanced, more innovative after time. Now, this was 1,000 years to develop tools and tradecraft up to the time of the ark. 1,000 years, give or take. Think about just back in your lifetime. Now, I'm getting more and more up there on the metrics there, but just back, when I was thinking about this lesson and thinking about some of these things, I graduated from Freed-Hardeman College in 1989. It was the year Al Gore invented the internet, so we didn't have the internet back then to be able to communicate. I was dating my wife Billy, and I were high school sweethearts, and we were dating through college. And you know what? There's these things for the young kids in here. There's things called a piece of paper and a pen, and you wrote words out, complete words, not about. You didn't write ABT. You wrote ABOUT, and then you put your thoughts on this piece of paper with the ink or the pencil, folded it up, put it in these little things called envelopes, licked it, put a stamp on it, and 3 or 4 or 5 days later, it might get to the intended recipient. And then they would read it, and then to respond, they would have to actually write down a letter and send it to you. It cost money to call from, she was going to school in Springfield, Missouri after she graduated from high school. So it cost to call from Springfield, Missouri to Henderson, Tennessee. It cost money to call from Henderson, Tennessee to Thayer, Missouri, where we grew up and we met. And so there were phone calls, but there were letters. There were no text messages. There were no cell phones back then. You went to the library. Yeah, Brad, it was hard. It was tough. If you wanted to do some research on a topic, you had to go to this thing called a library where they have printed books, and you had to read them. Wow, what a hassle. I had to do I think it was about a 25-page paper, 30-page, 25, 30-page, something. I thought it was unreasonable, of course. But anyway, the length of the paper that I had to write. In my senior computer information systems class, I can't even remember the name of the class was, but anyway, the whole main purpose of the project was to do some research and on a particular topic and write this long thesis paper and present it at the end of the semester. And at the time, Freed-Hardeman didn't have a whole lot of technology books, at least on the subject that I wanted to do my paper on, and we had a reciprocal agreement with the Memphis State University Library. So I had to drive an hour from Henderson, Tennessee to Memphis, Tennessee, just to check out some books to write my paper on. Certainly couldn't do any research over the internet. I was probably one of the few people on campus that actually had a computer. I had a Commodore 64 that had 64 kilobits of memory on it. To run a program, you had to use a 5.25-inch floppy drive just to run a program, and to save something, you had to take the floppy drive out and put another one in, or, I was really cool, I had 2 disk drives, so I could write my data to one, and I had a dot matrix printer, and I could do my papers and write them out and didn't have to worry about going to the library, or at the time, I don't even know if there's anybody on college campuses that does this these days, but used to have people that typed. You'd give them your written notes written out, and they would type you a paper for so much a page. Some of these ladies up here remember that. None of that exists anymore. That's just in 30 years. Now, I have a device in my pocket that I can do research on any topic that I want to. Sometimes the source you have to be careful of, because everything on the internet's true, right? So you might have to verify a source, but it's tremendously easier to do a paper these days and do research. So just think about that. They had 1,000 years to develop their tradecraft and tools to be able to build anything like this. So making the ark, Genesis 6 and 14, make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Does that sound like something that's real simple to build? Let's look at the size. Let's look at the size of this thing. So a cubit is generally considered to be about 18 inches, about 1.5 feet. That's a conservative estimate. That's on the low end. So if we take that measurement, 1.5 feet, the measurement of the ark is about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. So I have a measuring wheel. If you start at the back of our parking lot where the curb is at, by the grass, and go all the way out to Mexico Road, right to the end of it, that's about 300 feet. That's about a football field long. So you've got another 150 feet, another half of all that to go. Probably, I didn't play Frogger and curl across Mexico Road, my wheel. I wasn't that dedicated in measuring how long it was going to be to give you guys a visual, sorry. So that's probably almost all the way to the end of that field in the back of that building right across the street there. Probably close. So that's how long the ark was. 75 feet wide. If you go out and stand on our sidewalk, from sidewalk to sidewalk, that's about 75 feet, so it's wider than this building. And as far as the height goes, it's from about here to that back wall high. And so, it wasn't hugely high, about 10 foot per deck that they had there. So it could have been larger. A cubit is generally thought to be about 18 to 22 inches. If you go to Genesis 6 and verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. That cubit is generally considered to be the measurement from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, your second finger there. Could have been a lot longer. That's a conservative estimate on a cubit. We don't know for sure. As far as I know, there's no real recorded time frame where we actually have proof of how long a standard cubit was. Our foot measurement comes from some king in England. His actual foot was 12 inches long, is how that came from. I don't think we have anything back then where, we had some person that was named Cubit, that's actually where the measurement came from. So that's a general conservative estimate. So even if you're looking on the low end, this is what we're going to go with as far as what we're talking about today. So the materials in the construction, approximately 3.1 million board feet of lumber would have been required for this. This is huge. That's not a low semi-truck full of lumber, folks. That's a ton of lumber. Just think about how many board feet, even if you had really, really tall trees, right? You can't get a 16-foot piece of board out of a 12-foot tree, right? So even if you had trees that were 30 feet high that they fell, that's only a board that's you're probably going to get whatever 25 feet out of by the time it narrows at the top. That's a lot of boards. That's a lot of trees to cut. That's a lot of gopher trees to cut. We don't know what a gopher wood was. We don't know what the particular tree was. Maybe it was a tree that's around today, a hardwood tree or something that was just called gopher wood back then. We don't know. But 3.1 million board feet of lumber. Pitched was used inside and out. Does this sound like just something that was thrown together? Not to me. I don't know exactly what this pitch was. Probably some sort of a tar. I can't talk this afternoon or the second lesson. Some sort of a tar type of material, natural material that was used. Think about how many gallons of pitch they would have to gather just to waterproof the ark. Have you ever stained a deck? My back hurts just thinking about it. Think about how many gallons of stain it takes just to put a thin coat of stain on your deck. More than likely, this was a little bit more thicker of a substance than your typical stain. It was waterproofing the ark. More than likely, they had gaps to fill. You're not talking about probably fine hewn lumber like you're used to getting it. Well, sometimes getting at Lowe's. If you go try to get 15 2x4s at Lowe's, you're going through about 30 of them to find some that aren't, twisted around and about 3/4 crooked already, because of the wood that they get them from. But think about a log cabin style type of a construction, probably with hand-hewn type of logs, things like that. That's more than likely how the ark was depicted. You see, even with the ark experience thing down in Kentucky, they had to build that to be sustainable. The ark was a one-use, it was a throwaway thing. This wasn't meant to be a cruise ship, folks. It wasn't meant to take Noah and his family around the world to see the sights, it was a utilitarian vehicle. And so it would have had probably utilitarian shape. You've seen all the pictures where they have a little curlicue thing on the front of the ark. Man, if God tells me he's getting ready to destroy the earth and I better get in gear to build this thing, am I going to worry about building a little fancy curlicue on the front because it's going to look nice in all the pictures later on? I'm not. I'm slapping that thing together and putting it together as good as it can be, lasting for about a year, and I know it's not going to be a permanent kind of a shelter thing. But it was waterproofed. It was waterproofed with pitch inside and out. Probably filled the holes with some of that. You've seen some of these older log cabins and stuff where they put what they call chinking in between, where it kind of expands. Wood will expand and contract. It took them about 100 years to build this ark. I'm sure there was some settling and some gaps in that stuff, building it by hand and all that. Even if you're building something with modern lumber, it's still going to have some issues, still need to have some waterproofing. It had 3 decks, rooms inside, 1 door and a window. Almost certainly there were some ramps or stairs to get the people up and down, the animals up and down, to be able to service them. Remember, they were on the ark about a year, so there would have been poop to shovel, food to give the animals and all that stuff. A lot of people don't think about that. There were some daily farm chores. Think about how many animals would have been on the ark. Not going to get to that point yet, but and Dan will get to the animals tomorrow. I'm certainly not going to get to it. But, so there's your first starting point, Dan. So there had been a lot of farm chores to take care of every day, and they would have had to have some way to get to those animals. Could have been put together with just natural joints. If you ever watch some people that are really, really good, not me, but really, really good at woodworking, you can put together some stuff with some mortises or some dowel type things where you drill a hole and you pound a bigger peg into that hole, and that stuff will hold. You wet down the wood and it'll expand and it'll make a really, really tight joint. That takes some skill, some craftsmanship. I don't have that kind of skill. I'm more of a demolition person. You want me to tear down a structure? I'm your man. I can do good with that stuff. Putting together something fine like that, not so much. Could have been put together with metal spikes like nails they would have had at that time. Think about a larger type of a railroad spike kind of a thing that could have been hewn out by a blacksmith. That could have been used. Would have been a lot of them. So I'm not so sure how it was put together. It seems to me that from a logical standpoint, putting it together with some kind of a natural joint type of a thing like a log cabin is built with would make more sense to me. But I wasn't around back then, and we don't have any detailed explanation on how it was built, just the dimensions, what was to be built out of, waterproofing and all that stuff. All the rest of the things were either not shared with us in the Bible or Noah figured them out on his own. Main support beams, think about this structure. You couldn't just slap something like this together. It would have had to have had some design. It would have had to have some main beams that would support the weight of all that wood. Think about how much all the wood's going to weigh, just the wood. Then think about how much all the animals are going to weigh, right? Then think about how much the food is going to weigh that you got to carry for that long to keep the animals and the humans sustained. That's a lot of weight. You can't just slap some stuff together and not design it to be able to withstand all that. So it would have had some main beams, some supporting beams coming off of that. Flooring, pins for the animals more than likely because, there's just some animals that don't get along with each other in nature. They're going to be mortal enemies. Wait a minute, I've only got 2 of these things. They both got to survive so they can procreate. I better keep those birds separated from the cats, or the cat, whatever, that's on the ark, or we're going to have some problems, right? So almost assuredly, they're going to have some kind of pin, some way of separating. Maybe that was a separation on the floors. We just don't know that. But the animals would have had to have some separation. Building some pins inside the ark, or at least some holding pins. You can make a holding pin the size of this auditorium and put several animals in it of one particular kind that got along together, and you wouldn't have to worry about them eating one another. Maybe had nests inside there for the birds. We just don't know. But we do know that it was lots of physical effort just to gather all those materials, just to gather all that approximately 3 million board feet of lumber. Think about this. We think we have it bad, staining a deck, and I complained about that, and, I've got to cut the grass, or you got to do this and do that. Just rewind in history about 200 years. If you wanted a house, you didn't go to a realtor. You got yourself a piece of land, and you got yourself some neighbors, and that's one of the reasons a lot of people had big families back then. Guess what? They needed indentured servants to do all the work on the farm. It was a utilitarian thing. People didn't necessarily want to have 10 kids because they wanted to feed all of them. I need 10 kids. I need them spaced out so they can help us on the farm. It was a utilitarian thing oftentimes, not all the times, but oftentimes it was. And so if you wanted a house, you got with your neighbors or your family or whatever. If you look on old census records, I think are really fascinating to look at, because you can see over the years back in the 1700s to where, Joe and Mary had a house. Well, Joe and Mary had 4 kids. Well, you look down the next census, and Joe and Mary's oldest boy was 5 at that time. Well, the next census came along 10 years later. He was 15. Oh, wait a minute. Joe Bob lives in another house, and he's, guess what, the next house down. Well, they would have ridden, the census takers would have ridden a horse, more than likely, from one house to the next, and people would put them up and all that stuff if you read some of the history about that. And so you kind of see the progression of those things. So families typically lived in a tight-knit area, and so if you wanted a house a couple of 100 years ago, you went out and you got your tools and you felled the trees and you cut the lumber up and you hand-hewn the logs and you set the foundation there, and then you fought off the Indians, and then you were making your house. It's a long process, right? Similar things with this. They had to cut down the trees just to get the lumber. They had to gather all the pitch to be able to waterproof the ark. Whether they did that, in parallel or not, doesn't make much difference in the whole grand scheme of things. But those tasks had to be done. Lots and lots and lots and lots of man-hours to get that done. Did they have enough time? Well, let's look at the construction time frame. About 100 years to complete the construction. Did Noah have help with this outside of his family? I don't know. Maybe Noah was a prominent person, and it was one of those people. You've met people. I'm sure everybody has that. Everybody just likes old so and so. You can't find anybody that says anything bad about him. He's always willing to do something for somebody. Maybe that was Noah. Maybe Noah did a lot of favors for people. Maybe Noah had a lot of favors to call in, even though the world was wicked. You know what? You know what wicked people like? Even if they are wicked and they don't like the person? Money. You ever found a person that doesn't like to get some free money? Maybe not some free money. Maybe Noah hired some people to help him. We just don't know. Did he have to hire anybody? They didn't have any power tools, no air nailers, no log skidders. I would say that they probably had help from animals. We see back, clearly in the first century, they had chariots. I'm pretty sure it didn't take humans too long. It's like, well, that horse is pretty strong. Let's see. If I fashion me some rope out of some of these vines here, I bet he could pull a lot of weight. Humans are pretty innovative about being lazy, about getting help, right? How many times have you seen somebody try to figure out how to do something the lazy way, and if they'd just done it the first place, the first way they thought of, and the first way that they were told, instead of having to go here and do this and do that to make it easier on them, now, the subsequent repetitive tasks or whatever would be easier, I suppose, but it probably didn't take humans too long to figure out, hey, God gave us dominion over these animals, I'm going to put them to work. I'll give you some oats, maybe, something to eat later on, I'll treat you nice, place to live, but I'm going to get you to help me. I would suspect that animals had some things to do with the manual labor pieces on the ark. This is just speculation, sometimes my warped brain thinking through some things about what logically makes sense to me. Who knows? Maybe it didn't. Maybe Noah built the ark all by himself. We don't know. I suspect he had some help. I suspect they had some help from the animals. We just don't have a whole lot of details about the construction. We have time frame, we have how it was built, what it was supposed to be built out of, how it was to be waterproofed. 3 decks, a window and a ramp. That's really all we have. Everything else is speculation, but I think we can see from some historical things from mankind and how some things were accomplished about maybe some things that would have occurred or would have almost had to have occurred to get that done. How could they finish in time? This certainly was a gargantuan task. It was a huge task. You imagine Noah's day, he's living with all the evil stuff we talked about in the previous class period, and God comes to Noah Noah didn't have to, or God didn't have to knock on the door. I'm certain that whenever God spoke, there was no doubt. Just like when Judgment Day comes, there's no doubt. Hey, is that the judgment or is that an Amber Alert? Nope. Going to be no doubt. It's the Judgment Day. You're going to have no doubt about that. No doubt about when God's speaking. Back in the day, that it was God speaking. So God spoke to Noah. Can you imagine God coming to Noah and saying, the world's just wicked. I'm going to destroy the flood in 100 years. Here's what you got to build. Okay. Yes, sir. Here we go. Noah had enough faith in God that he was going to do what he said, right? Do you think Noah hesitated? Maybe Noah took a little bit of time to plan. I don't know if God planted the architecture and design for the ark in his head. We don't know. Maybe Noah was a master craftsman. Who knows? Maybe Noah, at the worst, took a day or two to set aside to think up of some plans in his head. It's like, all right, do you think he waited a month or two to start going and cutting down the trees for the gopher wood? You know what I would have done as soon as God stopped talking? Where's my saw? I'm getting to work. I'm at least cutting down the trees. We can plan this thing on the fly, man. We got a lot of logs to cut, a lot of logs to use. We can sketch out the thing on a napkin here in a minute. Let's go. Let's get this done. So it was a huge task. But if we look at this, you look at just 10 hours a day. Wow, 10 hours a day is a lot to work. You ever read some depictions of how hard people worked, especially people that farmed back in the 1800s or so? How long did they work? Sun up to sundown, as long as the sun was shining. Oftentimes after that. So if you just look at a conservative estimate here, this is kind of my conservative estimate, 10 hours a day is 3,650 hours per year just for one person, right? Christmas and New Year holiday wasn't in back then, so they didn't have to worry about taking those government holidays off. They weren't union back then. I'm not saying anything disparaging one way or the other about unions. So they didn't have restrictions on how long they could work. They didn't have a 15-minute break. God's getting ready to destroy the earth here. So that's around 365,000 hours in the 100 years of construction just for one person. So if we look at that, multiply that by 4 with just Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that's about 1.5 million man-hours. And then there's also going to be some more folks on the ark. If you add Noah's wife and their daughters-in-law, that's close to about 3 million man-hours worth with that 10 hours a day, working every day, to gather the gopher wood, to make the lumber, and to construct the ark. I don't know about you, but if that were me, I'd probably be working 12 hours a day. I might be finding a way, hey, let's get some of this pitch or something that'll burn and make us some torches kind of thing. We can do some of this stuff at night. Come on, in the wintertime, whenever the days get short. But a little over 3 million man-hours is quite a lot. I'm no construction expert, but if you look at some things that were built, back in the pyramid days and all that stuff, in pyramids, they had to carve these, 2-ton stones and haul them a few hundred miles. And these, the pyramids are huge. It's amazing how they did all that stuff. I'm almost willing to believe that aliens did it, but you read the depictions, it's like, wow, there were some really cool techniques with using some basic construction techniques with roller logs and pinions and all kinds of stuff that it could have been done back then. A lot of people died. The slaves were expendable back then. They didn't care. So you look at ancient construction with the pyramids and some of these other structures, how they could be done. Stonehenge and some of these other things. Those stones didn't come from right around that area. If the geologists tell us, we can believe what they say. So why is it so hard to believe that 8 people could take that long to build a structure like this if they had the tools and everything? If these were cavemen running around grunting that hadn't even developed any tools yet, well, yeah, that's a far stretch. That's not the case that we studied in the last period. It's right around the Bronze Age. They were building instruments long before Noah started building the ark. So they had the tools, they had the time, and they had the knowledge to do this. So that's building it. What could the ark hold? Everybody, you get a pushback a lot. Is like, how could the ark hold all this stuff? Well, let's look at this just a little bit. Given the conservative estimate of a cubit measurement, the 3 decks would have had about 33,000 square foot per deck. You add all that up, that's about 100,000 square feet overall, just to square footage if you're measuring a home. About 100,000 square foot, about the size of a decent warehouse you would have to hold things. It's about 1.5 million cubic feet, or about 17 Olympic swimming pools worth of storage that they had in the ark. This is the next one that I like. I got a lot of this information off of a Noah and the Flood video from the World Video Bible School, I believe. I ordered it off of AP, off Apologetics Press. Had a lot of good information. A lot of this stuff I took from them. So I certainly didn't think of all this myself. But it could fit almost 4 NASA space shuttles inside the ark. If you've ever seen a space shuttle up close in person, it's impressive. It's pretty big. I was down in Orlando back in the end of May and had enough time in my tech conference. It was winding down that I was attending that I spent just a few hours at the Cape Canaveral there. And the first thing I wanted to see was the shuttle. I'd never seen a shuttle on display up close and personal. They've got one there out in California, Washington, D.C., and then New York at the Intrepid Museum there, of the 4 surviving ones. And so these shuttles are pretty huge. They're pretty big. And you look at the size of that, and then think about, wow, almost 4 of those could fit inside the ark. All according to the person that did the World Video Bible School presentation, this DVD where I got this from, all but like the vertical stabilizer, the tail section of the 4th space shuttle could have fit inside the ark. So that's pretty impressive. If you talk to somebody and say, hey, did you know that almost 4 space shuttles could fit inside the ark? Oh, no. I say, yeah, let's look at this. Look at the size. And that's what the conservative estimates of the 1.5 feet per cubit measurement there. So if you want to look at boxcars, look at volume there. About 527 typical railroad boxcars could fit inside the ark as far as volume goes, stacked right on top of each other, front to back kind of a thing. So no way all the animals could fit in it, right? Well, if you look at what scientists try to tell us today with the millions upon millions of species, no, they couldn't. You're right. We've got 2 dogs at our house. One is a mutt terrier mix that we got from a shelter. The other one is a Shih Tzu. It's a Shih Tzu poodle mixture. Did they have a Shih Tzu dog on the ark? No, they had a dog. Dogs have not been domesticated with the American Kennel Club and all that stuff until the last few hundred years. This was thousands of years ago. There would have been dog, maybe a couple of different dogs, maybe a wolf, maybe a coyote type of a breed, I don't know. All the dogs that you've got domesticated in your house have a little bit of wolf DNA in them, right? They all came derived from a wolf. We have this strong wolf, kind of fearsome-looking thing, and now we bred them down to this furry fuzzball-looking funny thing with a snout nose, kind of pushed-in nose kind of deal. So that's where we've got as a human race. People think, hey, they had to have all these dogs and all these cats. There's hundreds of breeds of cats. No, there's cat, dog on the ark. And so estimates are anywhere from about 7,000 to about 21,000 species, but a lot of those species are water-bearing species. So you take out all those ones that are thriving going to be thriving in the flood. You don't have to worry about them on the ark. It's all the air-breathing ones, all the birds, all the amphibians. Certainly not anywhere like scientists want us to believe now. Also, nowhere in the Bible is there talk about that fully grown animals are on the ark. Yeah, they could have fit on there. Dinosaurs, elephants, hippopotamus, those things are certainly large, take up a lot of volume. But if you look at the average of all the mammal species that would have been out there, if you average it all out, taking a young adult or not necessarily a baby, babies are going to, from a logical standpoint, you're not going to want to take a newborn baby animal on the ark. That's just too much, they're too susceptible. You have to worry about feeding them milk and different kinds of foods. So juvenile, young animals on the ark. If you take their average size, it's about the size of a fully grown sheep. Have you ever seen a fully grown sheep? They look a lot bigger than they are. If you've ever seen a freshly sheared sheep, they look about like a dog. I mean, they let the wool grow out on them about like that, and they look big and puffy, look big and fat. They're not that fat. They're usually thin, and they're about the size of a dog, maybe 2.5 feet high, something like that. Maybe a big dog, maybe something that weighs 30, 40 pounds. That's about it. So if you average that out for the land-breathing mammals on the ark, oh, wait a minute. That's not that much space. Well, then, if you look at the vast majority of the species that we're talking about are reptiles. There's a ton more reptile species than there are air-breathing mammal type of species, the snails and frogs and snakes and worms and all that stuff. How much room are they going to? They're going to be much smaller than your average mammal, and there's certainly a couple of worms, male and female, take up a lot less space than a full-grown sheep, right? So if that's the majority of the species, would there have been enough room on the ark? Certainly. There's a lot of bird species on the ark. Think about how much room a bird's going to take up. Even if you get a big eagle, that's not that big. Lots of room on that ark. 400 and some odd boxcars full of stuff. Almost 4 full space shuttles full of room you could put on the ark. So was there really room? So if you're using conservative estimates, I think I'm going to get done. If you're using conservative estimates of the number of species and the juvenile and young animals, they would take up, if you bunched them all together, wadded them up in a pile, they're going to take up about 68 boxcars, according to estimates, or 13% of the space. Now, that's not saying that the animals only took up 13% of the space on the ark. One, that wouldn't make any sense. Why build an ark that big and make Noah go to all that trouble if you're only going to take up 13% of the space of the animals? What that's saying is you pile these animals on top of each other in a big heap, in a big cube, and that's what they're going to take up. 68 boxcars worth of cramming the animals in the ark with your foot kind of a thing, shoving them in there. No way that they can survive like that, but that's the approximated space. So if you're using modern recommendations for housing animals for long periods of time, and this came from, remember, we're using conservative estimates of 18 inches for a cubit measurement, right? Bare minimum that we can have record of anywhere. Could have been longer. Probably the minimum is about 18 inches. And so in using conservative estimates of the species that would have been on the ark, all the non-aquatic animals, and then if you go and use conservative estimates of housing animals for long term, this comes from recommendations by, I can't remember the organization, but it's some organization that has recommendations out for experiments for lab animals. So you're having animals in a lab environment, you're doing experiments on them all the time. This is the amount of space that they say that an animal should be given for long-term storage. And you're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes that these animals, they're talking about keeping them in a lab environment, sometimes longer. They're only going to be on the ark for a year, but we'll just go with their estimates. So if you look at using modern recommendations for housing for animals for long periods of time, it would only even then have taken up about 448 of those boxcars worth of space, or 70 to 85% of the space on the ark. That would have been about 15% at a minimum for housing, for food, and for storage. Could Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives all live pretty comfortably in the space of a boxcar? Yeah, if you've ever been on a boxcar, it's, I don't know, from about here to the end of there. Could you, if you were the only 8 people left on Earth, do you think you could survive in that amount of space? Yeah, sure. It was, again, a utilitarian type of stance. Not like they're going out to Applebee's for dinner. You know what they're doing every day? They're shoveling stuff out the ark, and they're shoveling stuff in at the animals, and they're trying to eat. That's what they're doing. And watching themselves bob around on the earth and wondering, man, when is this going to be over, kind of a thing. So 15% at a minimum for housing, food, and storage. That's still around 79 boxcars, or 250,000 cubic feet of space, just for the food, the storage, people to live, and all that stuff. So there really was room. There's plenty of room on the ark for the animals. There was plenty of room for the food, and Noah had for his family. They would have had to have about a year's worth of rations. You could shove a lot of stuff in, 79 boxcars. You take out one for Noah to live in, that's 78. That's a lot of storage. You pack that in carefully and, give again, a little bird, not going to eat near as much as a young elephant, right? So there was room on the ark. There was room for Noah and the family. There was room for food and supplies. There's no reason to think from a physical standpoint that all the species at the time couldn't fit on the ark. So put yourself again back in Noah's day. What's a flood? They certainly had water back then. Water is a key ingredient for life. You can survive several days without food. You can't go more than about 24 hours without water. You will die. You won't die if you don't have, you might think you're going to die, but you won't die if you don't eat for 24 hours. Had it even rained on the face of the earth yet? No. Maybe. I don't know that we can conclusively 100% say, and we can all go to heaven one way or the other. You know, if you believe that it didn't rain before then, or if you believe it did. What we have record of in the Bible is, you go back to Genesis 2, verses 4 through 7. This is the history of the heavens and the earth, and when they were created, and in that day the Lord God made the heavens and the earth, before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. You could read this as that, hey, it hadn't rained until the flood came, and look at it that way. I think that's okay. I think you can also look at this, though, that, hey, if we look at this sentence here, and again, this is mankind interpreting ancient language to a modern language, sometimes having an agenda, sometimes not. But if you look at this, it says, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth yet, and there was no man to till the ground. Could have indicated that after there was man to till the ground, that God did make it rain for the plants. I don't know. We do know for a fact that something cataclysmic happened, and I'm not even going to get into this. Dan, you can cover this tomorrow. Something cataclysmic happened with our environment after the flood. Just for the mere fact that we had people living 1,000 years. Noah didn't even have kids till he was 500. And then, so your age timeline is like this. After the flood, it's more than a 45-degree precipitous nosedive on the average lifespan. So something cataclysmic happened to our environment after the flood. Whether it was a cloud cover and this mist went up and people weren't subjected to harmful rays, I don't know what it was. There's all kinds of speculation, all kinds of theories. We do know that something happened. I don't know that we can say 100% that it hadn't rained yet. Maybe it had, maybe it hadn't. I don't know. It certainly had not flooded. We know that from a biblical standpoint. So imagine, if you will, Noah trying to convince a bunch of evil, corrupt, violent people that, hey, if you don't get on this ark, God's going to destroy the earth with water, with flood. It's going to rain. Imagine, if you can, in your own mind, whatever kind of weird statement, I'll get to you in a second, whatever weird kind of statement you can come up with. Mine is, hey, God tells me, again, not telling, God works on us this way these days, but imagine, if you will, God comes and talks to you, tells you that aliens are going to come and destroy the whole earth, and if you want to save yourself, you've got to buy a plot of land right in the prominent section of the commercial, retail side of your town, and build a 350-foot structure out of steel and put a big beacon on it. And you're going to have to tell people what you're building it for. Hey, man, aliens are going to come in 100 years. They're going to destroy the whole earth. You better get here and be ready to go up this tower, because this is where the aliens are going to land. This is their landing pod. Sadly, today, you'd have a lot of people say, hey, man, yeah, I've been thinking that for years. I read about that. I'm with you, brother. But probably back then, probably was an odd thing. That no doubt that this ark would have been the talk of the town. Yeah, Brett.
Even now, in 100 years, it's like, oh, even if they believe you that it's coming, they'll be like,
right, when?
100 years.
Right, exactly.
I'll worry about that next week or next year.
Right. Time frames were expanded back then, right? But yeah, even for 100 years, right? It would have been certainly a talk of the town. So it would have been a thing to talk about for 100 years. It would have been a real challenge to talk about. Think about you trying to talk about that for 10 years. Put that in our time frame. So our times are about a tenth of what a lifespan were back then, a little less. Think about talking about that for 10 years, building this big tower that the aliens are going to land on for 10 years. People are going to think you're crazy. You know, you're going to think, well, he wears a tinfoil hat, so the government doesn't read his thoughts at night. So that's what they thought about Noah. Now, some people may have been helping him out. It's like, I don't care if the dude wears a tinfoil hat. He's giving me money, so I'm going to work for him. I'll build a boat. I don't care, whatever. Good for you. So that had been a talk of the area. So one last slide I've got, just something else to think about. This is something odd that I think about once in a while. If it's so big, why hasn't it been found? Well, I don't know. It's really old and it rotted. It was made out of wood. Wood decays. But think about this for a while. It's probably used for shelter. Yeah? It destroyed, the water would destroy, the fountains blew up, the rain. If you've ever seen, hydraulic power is the most powerful force in the universe. That's why they use hydraulics to do all these. You compress this hydraulic fluid, and you can push something that weighs, not very much, a little thing like this, and compress it into, thousands and thousands of pounds worth of pressure. More than likely, if I'm thinking logically, hey, I need some food, I need a place to live. You got a perfect place to live right there in the ark. Once the ground dries up and all that stuff, let the animals have their fun. Man, we got a huge house. Yeah, man, we're not pent up by all these animals anymore. They're all gone. Might smell a little bit, but air it out a little bit. Maybe cut yourself another window in it to get a little cross ventilation. You got a nice house, right? Maybe they use it for shelter. I don't know. Maybe been taken apart to build their own houses later on. I'm just thinking logically, it's like, man, we spent 100 years cutting all this stuff. I'm just not going to let it sit. I mean, think about it from a logical standpoint. If you've gone to all that work to cut all that wood, what are you going to do? Are you going to set it on fire and have a big bonfire? No, you're thinking utilitarian. You're going to probably, more than likely, use that for some of your own devices. Build your own house, do whatever. They may have burned some of it for firewood, may have had some good burning pitch on it or whatever. But we don't know. We just don't know. They've had something the last, 4 or 5 years where they've done a scan. Oh, we found the ark. It's just about the right size. Well, they haven't really found anything yet. It's just a blob. That's a few thousand years old. Even if it was protected by pitch, man, it's going to be so destroyed. Even if it was left intact, I find it really, really difficult to believe that the ark, a structure that big, that took that few people, that long to build by hand, that they're just going to leave it set. It's like, hey, man, look what we built. Oh, yeah, you were there. Who cares? Nobody's going to care. You're looking for a place to live. You're looking for a place to get out of the elements. You're looking for something to keep you warm. Maybe they did use some of it for, there's probably lots of manure left on the ark to build fires with. They use that a lot over in other places of the world. Would have been a lot of things you could use that for. A lot of straw, a lot of different things. So hopefully these things have given you a little bit of things to think about, things to talk about maybe to somebody that, maybe kind of believes the story of the ark, but no way in the world anything could fit on there, no way they could have enough time to build all those. Maybe give you something to talk about. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your attention.